So to start with the common data attributes in validation, we are going to start there, create a new MVC project. We're going to call it validation. Okay, with these data attributes, these are called attributes, you apply them to the models, and so let's create a model. And our model is going to be a customer. So let's add a class called customer. And let's just go through the built-in stuff first. And so this is the stuff you've seen a little bit of review, probably going to be some new stuff too. So we'll start with a username, prop tab, string, username, get set, kind of give it a default of a string.empty. And the attributes, as you know, are decorated above the property. And the namespace, as you can see here, is system component model data annotation. So anytime you add these attributes, you need this using statement up top. And these can be overloaded. And so you could just say, hey, this is required, but you can also give it a custom error message. Error message equals, please enter a username. And so that's pretty straightforward. We can also add a regular expression. So regular expression are these JavaScript kind of validation, custom validation. You can write whatever validation you want. I personally am a fan of regex 101, which is a website that can help you build your own regular expressions. And so these are somewhat cryptic in nature, but as you get into studying them and using tools like this, they aren't terribly hard. So we've got some C# validation, and you can get into common validation tasks. Point is, I think we all know what regular expressions are at this point. You can write them yourself. You can use tools like regex 101. Let's write a regular expression on our username, basically with no special characters. And so I'll put in some quotes. And it'll look like the following. And I think this needs to go inside. Maybe not. Error message, username may not contain special characters. Let's take that. Take that right there. Okay. So username may not contain special characters. Again, these are the allowable, lowercase a to z, capital A to z, 0 through 9. And then this plus $ helps us concatenate that piece. So writing a regular expression on username, that is somewhat new for us. Let's add another property, date time, not data time, date time. It is nullable, so let's put a question mark there, called DOB, date of birth, get set. Error message equals, no quote there, just like up top, error message equals. Now, the other somewhat newer is a range attribute. And the book does go in detail, kind of explaining the challenges that this range has with date and times. So we'll see kind of how this works out of the book. Now, this is looking good. Type of date time. And let's see, this is like 1900 to 2020. Let's just kind of, sure. Do you know anybody that was born before 1900? I don't. Why don't we go ahead and update this to, sure, 2024. Date must be between, sure. Now, I'm just operating off of memory, and again, I'm just remembering that this range has a hard time with date times. If you know anything about date times, they can be a pain, right? Figuring out 10 days ago, 10 days into the future. Date and time is always one of those data types, converting between, oh, you're reading out of a database and you're converting it into C#. You know, date times are always a challenge, so no big deal. Then we're going to have a password and a confirm password. Public string password. And let's just add a public string confirm password. And required. Please enter a password. And string length is another one that we haven't hit too hard. This is a maximum number of characters. So string length, again, nothing longer than 25 characters is kind of that argument that you're passing into string length. And another kind of neat one that we haven't really done much with is the compare. And we're going to compare it to confirm password so that we make sure that they match. So that's kind of cool. That's a pretty common thing, obviously, on website registration. You got to have a password and a confirm password. So that's nice to have this compare attribute. And let's bring in required. Here's another new one. The display column. So this display will change the text that the user sees in the view. And so it's a little bit more user-friendly to change the display. Obviously, you don't want the word confirm password being one word. You want it being 2 words. And so you can change the display to kind of get a different If you're just using the built-in properties, you don't, that's, I don't know if you guys have seen that or not, where you're just using that. A couple people nod their head. Great, thank you. So that's basically it. These are the common built-in attributes. The only thing that I remember as well is that this range works with basically all the built-in data types. There's a little note here. Any data type that implements iComparable can be used with the range attribute, right? So just turns out most of the data types that are built in, ints, doubles, chars, flows, all this kind of stuff, implement iComparable, therefore they can all be used with ranges. Okay, now to scaffold this out, there's kind of a neat little trick. We can go ahead and build out the controllers and build out the views. But one thing we haven't done a lot, but if you paid close attention during one of the code alongs, like let's add a customer controller, right? So let's add, at this point, a controller. And there was this other option to use MVC controller with views using Entity Framework. Now, well, we don't have a context class. Let's see. An MVC controller with actions to create, read, update, and delete. So we're going to have to create empty unless... yeah, let's just create an empty. If we had a context file and all that, we could have used this cheat code, but where they kind of what they call it, scaffolding. They basically template it out for you to customize it, but that's okay. Customer controller. And let's just pretend like we have an add method. And therefore, we need an add view. So let's go views, right click, add a folder for customer, and add a view called add, so that we can H1 add a customer. So customer controller with an add method, add view. Let's just kind of boot it up and navigate to that view. So we should be able to go to /customer/add. We hit our landing page. Okay, so now we need our form here. And did we not on Get Bootstrap see that form group was the old way of doing things? Get Bootstrap, I think they got rid of form group, did they not? In Bootstrap 5, they got rid of form group. So let's just hit our overview of forms. Yeah, there's no more form group. So everything's just going to be inside of a div for our line breaks. And our divs just have a little bit of margin on them. End the div. Let's just end the form. And end the quote. Okay, back to our fields. We're going to have a username, date of birth, password, and confirm. So let's do label. Let's make this a strongly typed model. Let's add the bootstrap class of so username. Let's throw our submit button. So there's our username. Now date of birth. One thing that you may realize, our input tag, I kind of let .NET resolve the type of control that it is by having a strongly typed model. It's like username, oh, this is going to be an input type of text, versus this one, if I do label ASP4 DOB, it might be a different kind of control, like a date time picker, and I'm sure you guys have seen that. Date of birth. And then last but not least, confirm password. What's the question?
You use display on the class for confirm password. Put space in there. How would you use that on here?
The display. What do you mean the display?
You did display name equals confirm password on the customer class. How is that used?
Oh, okay. Yeah, I see what you're saying. So there are built-in kind of helpers where, let's see, and you've probably seen this where it's like you can do HTML helpers, HTML dot, and then you can just read the name of the property, as in just whatever the model, and so there's, yeah, let me find out that actual line of code, and then I can show you better. Okay, so here we can do @HTML dot label 4, and then you say model arrow model dot confirm password. Okay, so you're using this HTML helper, little razor code, and then now this should read that display. So good question. And you've probably seen this if you've seen different razor pages where they're using these little helper HTML label 4, whereas I just hard coded it in, you know. Did I close it? I did close it. Let's boot it back up. Of course, we have a little bit more coding to do in the controller. Come on, here it is. Okay, and so you can see confirm password. This is now using that display. But of course, we have to code up a little bit in the controller. So let's go back to the customer controller. And this is a get, HTTP get, and we need a public iAction result add customer C. We need a using here, using models to recognize our customer. And if model state is valid, we can do just a simple if else. So if it's good, return, and I'm just going to return content customer added successfully. Otherwise, return to the view. Okay, and so now our controller is wired up, and that should be what we need. Oh, nope, a little bit more. Of course, we need our div to kind of handle all the error messages. Div ASP validation summary of all. Class is text. We'll bootstrap red text. Close the div. Okay. Okay, please enter a username. Username with special characters. Username may not contain special characters. So there's our regular blah, blah, blah expression. Date of birth. Sure. Password. Admin. Confirm password. Admin. Again, letting the default types resolve. Not a good idea here on password. It's not putting my little stars. See, this is probably part of the problem when I'm out of the box. Date and time's not playing nice. I mean, it is. Let's just select something a year ago, just to make sure that it's got time on it.
January 1st, 2024.
Oh, January 1st, 2024. Okay, let's see now. There we go. So okay, that is playing nice out of the box. Very cool. Password and confirm password do not match. And then please confirm your password. So admin2. And out of the box, tons of functionality with these built-in attributes. Very cool, 2 thumbs up. I am questioning kind of the problem with date time. Again, I thought I remember more of a problem, but it didn't really seem to give me too much of a problem other than my own logic error. Okay. Those are the common built-in. Questions before we move on? Yes.
One thing I found out.
Beautiful. So let's do that. So .html label for model. And then is that like that?
That's it.
Beautiful. That's easier. I kind of want to tinker with this to get the date to break. Yeah, James.
You might just go back to your
Customer controller. I want to go back and point out a piece of theory here. You know, we marked date time as nullable, and so required checks, and it's kind of like a truthy kind of thing, and it checks for a nullable value. And so you guys might remember, if you remember some of these validation messages, like these custom messages, actually don't show up properly when you don't mark some data types as nullable. Like this would probably work, but you just wouldn't get the right validation message out of the box. And so because this required checks for null, it is pretty common if a data type is not nullable by default to mark these as nullables so that required can check for null and give the appropriate error message if it is in fact left empty or whatnot. All right, I'm gonna click around a little bit more, see if I can't get DOB to break. Oh, one other place I'm gonna point out, because the question is, you know, hey, where does this show up, right? Jacob, you asked that question, where does that show up? And I kind of showed you how to code that in the view, how to get that to show up. It's also in the default error messages. Like if you didn't provide, it'll say confirm password cannot be blank, and confirm password would be one word in the error message. Okay, so there's a couple of places it could show up if you don't change the display. All right, I'm not gonna try and make it break anymore. The next thing I want to point out, okay, and this is actually pretty cool, and if you've been paying close attention, I don't even know if I noticed this until you actually get to this section. Check this out, right? So I want everyone to watch right here. See where my mouse is? Okay, now watch when I click the button. Watch what happens on the tab. Okay? Okay? You see that little snap? Okay, that little snap means something. Okay, this little snap means that the client sends a request to the server and the server responds. Okay, you call that a good old round trip, right? That's a round trip to the server, back to the client. Therefore, you know the validation messages that we're looking at here are, and now it's all tying, I'm remembering, these are server-side validation errors, right? This is like the equivalent of joy, you know, joy in JavaScript saying, no, this is not allowed. This is our server giving these validation error messages, okay? It's a little bit better to have client-side, okay? Just going back, it's very simple theory. You know, validation can be done in 3 places. Validation can be done on the client, validation can be done on the server, and validation can be done in the database. Okay? The most secure applications do all 3. Okay? So this is one layer, which is server-side validation. Can you do this validation on the client side? And actually, yes, it's crazy simple to do this. Okay, to actually do this client-side validation. So I just want to start by looking at, under shared, I'm going to look at our layout. And notice we've got an asynchronous, I'm going to write this asynchronously. We've got this asynchronous section called scripts that is not required. So we can add, this is really cool, you can add these scripts to any view. Okay, now what are these scripts? Well, validation scripts partial. Okay, here are our scripts. We are adding a jQuery validation library and a jQuery validate unobtrusive library. Basically, jQuery is a JavaScript library, and this is client-side validation. So again, to kind of look here, we have this ability to add this script section to any view. And by adding this script section to our view, we are getting these libraries, okay, on one page, not all of our pages. So I want to asynchronously call that script section inside of my view. All right, so what I'm going to do is at the bottom of my view, I'm going to have a section called scripts. Again, this is all convention, so the name scripts has to be exactly that, capital S. Obviously, it matches what we were just looking at. Not section writers, lowercase section. Come on now. And here we're going to write a razor block that awaits. I'm going to try and write more asynchronous going forward. Clearly, the more modern approach is to write asynchronous code. Okay, so just by adding this little tag to our view, let's go back to our let's go back to our page. Let's see if I still got it booted up. I always tend to close it. Okay, and it's /customer/add. I'm gonna start by inspecting. Actually, let's watch the tab and see if it refreshes. Hey, no refresh, AKA client-side validation. Okay, no more round trip. You're gonna get a little bit better. Now, check this out. Let's do username Evan Gudmestead. Client-side validation, no round trip. Date of birth, again, I got to fix this to include 24, but since it's not, let's just select that. And actually, I want to give an invalid date. Sorry, that's the problem. I want to give an invalid date, January 16. Let's put, what I'm watching is to see the date and time if it's still doing client validation, and it is. Notice I'm not doing a round trip and it's throwing a fit. It's not happy. My date is out of range. If I put that in, there we go. This is where the date and time doesn't do well, is on this client-side validation. I knew there was a problem. I didn't remember where. Pointing out that this worked when it was just doing server-side validation, but to get this to work client-side, you have to do some customization, which we can walk through. But it does not play well. The range does not play well with the built-in client-side validation. Okay? That is exactly the problem. Doesn't really matter. Now, check it out. Just to kind of demonstrate that it is that, let me take this back out, save it, and go back here and select something from 2023. Admin. See, it goes right through. When you're doing the server-side validation, it does handle the dates pretty well. When you are doing the client side, though, let me Control-Z, bring back in my scripts. This should be valid, but we're hitting an error because of the challenges that client-side validation has with this range. Okay, and you know, fixing that, I can walk you guys through fixing that, but I actually have a different example that I want to do, and maybe we can kind of round back to this. So I'm going to do a different example instead of diving down the rabbit hole on fixing this on the client side. I have a different example. Maybe we come back. To dive a little more into what's going on here, if you inspect the page, you know, there's a couple of things going on that you may or may not realize. Notice this div right here. Let me minimize this just to inspect the page. We've got a div that is our validation summary, that if you were to dive into the CSS, you're just going to see that div is hidden. Okay, so when you hit these validation errors, this div is unhidden using the JavaScript, right? That's what JavaScript's really good at, is hiding things and unhiding things. Also, what tends to happen is classes are added right? So if you were to put the validate for, you would see that a red error. Let's do that. Let's do a span ASP validation for username, and probably closing span is the right tag. Typically what it does is it puts little classes on let me inspect. Usually, take a look now, this input class of form control has a class of input validation error. Clearly that's not there when you load the page. So there's also these data val attributes that are used. Data val, the data hyphen attributes, MDN. These data attributes are not something that we're super familiar with, that we haven't used. But it starts with data hyphen, and it's completely customizable, and you can store whatever you want in these. So data hyphen columns, data hyphen, these are just customized attributes. You can call these whatever you want. You could store values in them, and then your scripts can use them, right? So these are completely customizable HTML attributes that are used here. Data hyphen val regex. These are all going to be used by client-side scripts like jQuery to format these controls, right? So just to understand a little bit of what's going on behind the scenes, you know, we're adding classes, we're removing classes, we're hiding divs, we're showing divs. The scripts are using these data attributes to kind of like get JavaScript regular expressions, and here's a pattern, you know. So there's a lot going on kind of under the hood that you may not have been super familiar with. The class of input validation error. There's a way, and maybe we're not linking to a certain script, because notice there is a class called input validation error right here, and I'm not seeing that class applying any CSS. And so usually one thing that we get here that I'm not seeing is input validation error puts a red highlight around this box. And I'm not seeing that, so it makes me wonder if I'm not linking to a CSS file to apply that class of input validation error. Hang tight. Let me look around. So I got frustrated enough, I wrote my own CSS. There you go. So now by going to site.css and just simply changing the border color of the text box with the class of input validation error, you get the red. I'm pretty sure that should be a quote-unquote out-of-the-box feature, but it just wasn't working for me, so I did that. All right. So a couple things to look at. Date of birth kind of acting a little wonky. But let's kind of move on to another concept, which is this idea of these attributes that we've covered today. Let me close all this down. Let me go back to my class, right? There are other scenarios that aren't covered here that you might want to validate for, okay? And so one example that kind of comes to mind is, and you guys did this, you know, you had a file upload control where, you know, could a user upload a text document? Could a user upload an executable? You know, you are allowing with an input control a post to the server with allowing a client to kind of put whatever they wanted up there. And so there are what are called custom attributes. These are the built-in attributes, obviously, that support a very probably 95% wide array of solutions for validation. However, you might want to do a custom attribute to handle scenarios like I got this built-in range, it's not really working well. That's one scenario. With client-side validation, you might want to kind of customize this to work well with ranges. Okay, and that's one use of these custom attributes. Another one is with that server-side control to only allow certain file types uploaded to the server. So I'm going to go ahead and do a custom attribute. Okay, and I'm going to do this inside of I'm just going to add a folder here called utility. And inside of here, I'm going to add a class. And like everything, the class name is convention. I'm going to call this allowed extensions attribute. And again, what I'm doing here is I'm making my own custom attribute. And the way that this is actually pretty easy is with inheritance. You have to inherit from a class validation attribute data annotations. Okay, so we can make our own attribute. We do that by making a class and by putting the word attribute here is the convention. This is called allowed extensions. And once you do this, I kind of would expect a lot of times you inherit, it forces you to override some things. But let's bring in the code snippet that we're getting here. So we have a constructor. First off, we have an instance field called underscore extension. It allows a string array. Okay, so this is just a string array that this string array is going to include JPEGs and GIFs and whatever types of extensions you will allow the user to upload. Okay, so in the constructor of this allowed extension, we're going to pass in a string array, right? And so that's kind of the first part, is setting the allowable types in the constructor. And then the second part is writing this is valid method. You override this is valid method, which again, when you inherit, what are you overriding here? You're overriding the is valid from the parent validation attribute. Notice our data type is this iForm file. And again, this is kind of the code fill. This is not exactly what I have. Let me see here. If it's not a file coming from an iForm file, obviously that's considered false. And here we're going to say our extension. We're going to read the extension from the file. So the first thing is, hey, did you get the file from a iForm file data type? If it's not an iForm file data type, then it's not a valid extension. Second thing here, let's get the extension on that. If it's an executable, if it's what is the file extension? This reads the file extension. This returns true or false if our extensions array contains the extension on that file. So it returns true, meaning it is valid, or it returns false. Alright, so if you're following along, the next step is to add this allowed extensions attribute to our model. And so I'm going to open up my customer model, and I kind of kick the can on this date and time. So just for now, I'm just going to maybe comment out my date and time. And I'm just going to replace that with a image. And so I'll do a public iForm file. We'll call it photo or image get set. And we'll make this nullable. And we are going to add our custom attribute for allowed extensions. Of course, we need to add a using statement. Allowed extensions, and we're going to pass in a, notice it accepts a string array, so we'll pass in a new string array of JPEGs, PNGs, or JPEGs. So now we're using our custom attribute, allowing these 3 types of uploads. And now we need to put a file upload inside of our view. Let's kind of open up our view. Customer add. We got rid of date of birth. And let's add in a div. Okay, no label for this, just input control. Close you down. Close you down. Bring it back up. Oh, I realized one more thing. Since our form now takes this type of image, we're allowing, we have to add this enc type equals multi-part form data to get that to work. Okay, so we got a few types that we allow, JPEGs and PNGs. Let's try and upload a video. 55-second video. And this is client-side validation that we're seeing before our server-side validation. And so this is kind of the one, it's not seamless when you have both. And so it's kind of weird to hit client-side validation, fix the client-side validation, and then hit your server-side validation. It's like 2 sets of validation error messages. But nonetheless, this is server-side validation. It says the field image is invalid. The field image is invalid. Of course, we could add our own And then customer added successfully. So couple things there. You can add. How do you fix that? You can add a method to the jQuery validate library, so you could actually get this validating on client and server. That's probably the fix there. That way you don't get two different sets of validation error messages. What you want is you want the same validation on the client and the server. That avoids the two different sets of errors. And to point that out, now the logic to do that is not short, but they do go through and showing you how to customize client-side validation on page 425. There is a method called add validation, where you can get that problem fixed. Okay. Maybe let's see where I want to go from here. The next, what I think is very useful, validation control, or attribute, I should say, is an attribute called remote. And so this allows you to interact with the database and check to see, for example, if a user already exists. And so you can get, in our case, we have a customer with the username. We could see if that username exists in a database already, right? And we're not going to allow a user to register again if they already exist. Okay, so this is an attribute called remote. To find it in our book, we're looking at page 429. All right, so for this to work, we actually need to wire up a database. Since we don't have a database, let's go ahead and wire one up. And so I'm going to go to my package manager, bring in Entity Framework, tools, the green check mark, SQL Server. All right, so in our app settings, let's add a connection string here. Connection strings. And I'll just copy and paste from another project, as we've done many times. I'll just call this my customers DB. Customers connection string is the name of that. My database, customers DB. And keep everything else de facto. I'll need to create program CS. Builder services. Okay, I need a DB context, so let's wire up a DB context. Customer, add, class, customer context, inherits from DB context. I'm just going to seed maybe one customer, so this is close but not what I want. Entity of customer dot has data. And I need to make sure that my customer has a customer ID. Let's bring in a customer ID. So customer ID, username, password, and confirm password. Did I put this in the wrong spot? I put this in the wrong spot. Let me move this to my models folder. Now it recognizes my type. Username. Okay, cool. So just seed one customer here. And then what we're going to do is see if that username exists in our database. And if it does, you don't allow them to register twice. Again, I think the exercise is pretty cool because I think that's pretty realistic. You don't want the same customer to register twice. And you have to hit the database to see your customers in order to do that. And so, what are we forgetting? Now we got to go back here into program CS. Now we have a context file, builder services, add DB context. what do we call that? Our customer context, I think. Customer context. Use SQL Server. Get connection string. We called it our customer CS. And now we should be able to add a migration and create the database. So let's see what breaks. Add migration initial. See if it plays nice. Okay. Customer image is a ViForm file. Otherwise, ignore the property using to not mapped on model create. Okay, so maybe we add not mapped. It's not liking my image. Make this happy for now. We'll mark it as not mapped. Try again. Okay. And now you can see we're not actually storing our image for now in the database, which is cool. Storing images in the database is a whole other can of worms. But we create a table and we should insert data into that table. So now update database. Can't spell. Update. Can't spell again. Here's our customer DB. Customers table. There's our customer. Now we are ready to work with the remote attribute. Okay, the way this works, let me kind of close. We're going to go into our controllers. We're going to add a validation controller. Add a controller called validation controller. Inherits from controller. We're going to bring in our context. Customer context, read only customer context called context. This is where we write our logic to hit the database. Public. This is the first time also our controller returns a bit of JSON. So JSON result called check username. And let's see We accept a username into our method. We write a little bit of link to hit the database to see if that username exists. If it doesn't, we're returning a true, meaning we should be, it passes validation. That's what that true means. Otherwise, we return JSON that says username already in the database. Let me see if I want to customize this at all. Okay, I think this is good enough to get us started. So again, for this to work, we had to create a controller called validation controller. We wrote one method called check username. And now we can go back to our customer class. Again, I find this pretty cool. I'm going to apply a remote. And you can like hard code it and spell it out. The remote action is check username and the controller is validation. You can actually leave these two pieces off here. I actually like leaving them on. So this does the same thing. It's method and controller, but why not leave the explicit what's going on? All right, let's try this out and see what breaks. And so when we go to add a customer that already exists, I'm expecting username is already in use. If it works, otherwise I'm forgetting something and we'll see what that is. So / customer add. How about that? Because we've got client-side validation, as soon as I tabbed off, I didn't even have to hit the server. We get the username Evan Gudmestead is already in use. That is slick. I like that. That is very cool. That, by and large, those are the major concepts of this chapter.